I'm overwhelmed, is all I can say. And there was never any kind of word. It wasn't like, build a school. There was nothing like that.
Right.
Okay? But it was this immense feeling. And even when I talk about it now, I get a little teary. Mm-hmm. And that was, 18 years ago.
Right. So
I walk out of the chapel, and I'm into the sunlight, and I know something happened because John said to me, "Are you okay?" I said, I don't know. I don't know what just happened to me. Was it hypoglycemia? I don't know what it was. Wow. But it was physical. Mm-hmm. It really took me over. So I am bewildered. Mm-hmm. And you know me enough to know that I'm not bewildered all that often. Right. I'm bewildered. I'm kind of quiet, and again, not a typical thing of Rich Clark, and I'm stunned.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 1 of the Rich Clark series on Circulate. My name is Gary Martin, the host and producer of Circulate. In episode 1, you'll hear Rich talk about how Cristo Rey Network was started. Cristo Rey Network is a network of high schools around the country that services inner city students. The way the model works is that one day a week, students don't go to their high school, they go to work to help pay for their high school tuition. I'm a product of one of the Cristo Rey Network schools. I went to St. Martin de Porres High School in Cleveland, Ohio. St. Martin de Porres High School was started by Rich Clark in 2003. Before starting St. Martin de Porres High School, Rich Clark was also the principal at St. Ignatius High School, which is one of the prestigious all-boy Jesuit high schools in Cleveland, Ohio. Really excited for you guys to listen to this episode. Rich is a great storyteller. I think I might nickname him the storyteller after hearing him talk about the great story about how Cristo Rey Network was started, as well as how he came to found St. Martin de Porres. In this episode, you will hear me say wow a lot because just how near and dear this story is to my heart, and how I think, if I'm being honest with myself, the little success I have to this point, I think really comes from this story. Without Rich starting the high school, I can't really say that I would be where I am today. And that's not to discredit the hard work I put in, but the school ultimately created an opportunity for me to take advantage of. So without further ado, here's Rich Clark and episode 1. Hello, everyone. This is Gary Martin. This is episode 1 of Circulate with Rich Clark. Rich Clark is the founder of St. Martin de Porres High School in Cleveland, Ohio. Actually, the high school that I went to as a young adult, I would say. Rich is a very important guy to me in terms of just creating the school to actually change my life and put me in a direction to where I've been able to do some things that I didn't expect at the time, and kind of how I'm here today and able to kind of be in a situation to bring this information to you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Rich Clark. How you doing, Rich?
Good, Gary. How are you? Thanks for the kind words.
No problem. I'm doing well, so I'm excited that we're able to record here. Just first question, I think, before you came to St. Martin de Porres, you were involved in a school a little bit different than St. Martin de Porres on the west side of Cleveland, and St. Martin's on the east side of Cleveland, called St. Ignatius, a school with a little bit more tradition, great all-boy high school, Catholic all-boy high school that you might see in a lot of other cities around the country. But if you could, can you kind of take me back to your time at Ignatius and kind of lead up into how you came to think of, I have to create this school on the east side of Cleveland for inner city kids?
Right. Okay. No small task. Well, I myself went to a Jesuit school when I was in high school back in Chicago, in Loyola Academy, and I went to Georgetown University, another Jesuit school, before John Thompson. So it was it was a sleepy little college on the hill there. And then I came back and taught at my alma mater for 18 years. And I gradually wanted to become a administrator, a principal. The man that was the principal at Loyola Academy was a great guy. He was my mentor, and he wasn't going anywhere. Mm-hmm. So I had to start looking other places. And I married a woman from Cleveland, so one of the possibilities would be Cleveland. Mm-hmm. And they were looking for a principal, and I applied. I didn't think I had much of a chance because I was a layman, And they had never had a layman as a president. Always been a Jesuit priest. So, and they're a very traditional school, as I came to find out when I came here. And grace of God, I got the job. So I was a 40-year-old lay principal, never done it, never been a principal before. They never had a lay principal.
Wow.
Here I was.
Wow.
So I had a great mentor, Father Bob Welsh, who brought me along and was just a great friend of mine, really, as it turned out. So I came to that school, and it is a great school. It was at that time there were about 1,100 boys. I was coming from a school of 2,000 boys, so it wasn't overwhelming to me.
Right.
But then, it started to hit on all cylinders a little bit before I got there. I kind of got hired at a lucky period, I think, because they had won a state championship in football, whereas before they were never good at football, and they were the brainiac school. That was kind of what they were, and that's all they kind of excelled in, which is not a bad thing for a school to excel in.
Right.
And then as I came there, they started winning championships like regularly, national championship, USA Today, that kind of stuff. And it brought a lot of excitement to the school. It brought a lot of kids to the school, and the school began to grow. And then there was a very wealthy benefactor, Jerry Murphy was his name. God bless his soul. And he was, Murphy Oil Soap was his claim to fame. And he built an intramural gym. He remodeled a 20-year-old or 30-year-old science center. He built a chapel. A chapel's an understatement. It's a $5 million huge building.
And what year is this around?
Well, this starts in 91.
Okay.
And then I left in 2003. So most of this happened probably in the first 8 years of my
So you're like Tyronn Lue, and you're the coach that gets the great
walked
team.
into LeBron.
Right.
And so Bob Welsh was a great fundraiser and a great storyteller. He could really tell the story of why coming to Ignatius was important for a young man, and I was a great foil with him. We were a good dog and pony show where we could talk and joke, and we just were good together. It was a perfect duo. I don't know if he'd say that, but I would. So it was great. He left, and then a guy named Father Kosicki came, and he too was good. He was a very young president. He'd never done it before, had a little experience, but he was a natural. And he had a great management team. I say that about myself and other people, but like the CFO and the fundraiser, we'd been there for years, and this was a well-oiled machine, so to speak.
Right.
He came along and just listened for a while and let us do our thing, and then picked up where Bob Welsh left off, and that was great. So in the year 2000 is where my life changed forever, and that's a long story. I don't know how much time we got. But,
well, we got plenty of time.
Okay. Oh, geez. So anyway, a good friend of mine, John Foley, Father John Foley, the Jesuit priest, I had met him back in 1976. He was a missionary in Peru. And he had come back to the States for a sabbatical. He was at Loyola Academy where I was. He was living there, going to Loyola U for a counseling course, and I met him in that course. And that's another funny story for maybe podcast 10 or whatever.
Okay.
We met, and we hatched this plot of taking 12 students from Loyola Academy and plopping them down in Peru, not as a tourist, but as trying to understand what it is like to live in the third world. So a true third world experience. So we did, and it was 8 weeks. It was a long period of time to do that. And I think we were the first high school to ever do that in the United States, to bring a group of kids like that and have that experience. We worked on a farm. We gathered up corn stalks every day.
Wow.
There were no electricity. We had to go to the village and buy candles. I mean, it was third world. And that was a beautiful experience. And there were a lot of students from that first and second and third trip that I was involved in. Oddly enough, jump ahead a little bit, were involved in the Cristo Rey movement later on. And that was a lot later on. It was 20 years later when that school first started in Chicago. But the person who started that school was John Foley. Oh. They called him back, and he ran schools in Peru, so he knew what he was doing. And they said, start a school for Latinos in Chicago. And in a neighborhood which, was very under-resourced, to say the least.
And this is 19...
He came back in 93, maybe, 4.
Okay.
And the school opened in 96.
Okay.
So they came to devise the school, and, of course, the biggest problem was how are we going to pay for it? Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, literally probably 8 minutes by car, St. Ignatius College Prep in Chicago is, and there were other very expensive schools nearby.
Right.
But as it turned out, there wasn't a single student from that zip code going to St. Ignatius.
Okay.
Okay, so it was two worlds. So a guy, they had actually hired a marketer to kind of help them market the school. And they said, how are we going to afford this? How are we going to afford this? And the guy said, well, I went to a school in college where you worked and that paid your tuition, And, wow, maybe we could do that in high school.
What? So who's this guy? Just the marketing guy randomly?
Just randomly said that. They just out of the blue. His name was Rick. I forget his last name. Rick. And I never met him. I didn't know the guy.
Wow.
So John Foley, who was originally from Chicago, and he's a masterful storyteller and totally mission-driven guy. He went around, and so his family knew people in Chicago, so he could get into a CEO's office. And so he did. He went around asking people, would you hire kids to do this? And as he says, we just start getting too many yeses. In other words, it was like, God, this might work. They start the school, and the first day they send kids out, the young woman calls back in tears, and she says, I can't get in my building. What's wrong? Well, the door won't stop going around.
What?
She'd never seen a revolving door.
That's
she had no idea how it worked. Then they got another call. Kids in the Sears, what was then called the Sears Tower, said, there's no elevator to my floor. He didn't understand there were banks of elevators.
Oh, wow.
So they had no training, in other words. So lesson one was, we better train these kids.
Yeah, you can't just send them out. Wow.
But that's how, it was just such an exciting new idea. Nobody thought about that. So anyway, but then what they saw, almost within a week or two, kids coming back excited about going one day a week to work, wearing, the company clothing, going to the cafeteria, and had coworkers taking them out to lunch, and wow, the school's great. I love it.
Right,
so, it became an overnight success. So that was it for a while. And I, at the time I was at Ignatius, I was totally into Jesuit education. I was on the Jesuit Secondary Education Association National Board. My wife said I was more Jesuit than Jesuit. I mean, it's just, that's all I thought of.
You weren't a layman really anymore.
I wasn't a layman anymore, really. I wasn't. I was on the North Central Association Ohio Committee. That's an accrediting association for universities and high schools. And their annual meeting was in Chicago, which is where I was from. So it was great. So I'd go to Chicago once a year. I'd go visit my friend John Foley and see the school.
Right.
And it was phenomenal. It was in an old, believe it or not, Slovenian grade school.
Like we have here?
Like we have here. That's kind of really strange. But it was an abandoned parish. They had left the parish. But it was a Slovenian school. I'll never forget that. And but the kids were so exciting. I went there at Our Lady of Tepeyac, or what's known as to the gringos, Guadalupe, the feast day. And the parents were there cooking, and it was just it was an exciting school full of life and family. It was just so great. So that's that. But, even John at that time wasn't thinking about number two. It was just, this was a school, and we were doing it, and it was working. The guy who worked on the corporate work study program, which is coordinating the kids getting the jobs and getting them to go to work, was a young man named Preston Kendall, who was, believe it or not, a member of that first Peru trip.
Right.
And he read about Foley starting a school in the Sun-Times. Actually, his wife did. And said, hey, look, John Foley. He was an executive at an insurance company, living very well. He calls up John Foley and just says, hey, John, if there's anything. Well, Preston, would you want to come and work here and invent the work program?
Wow.
And he said yes. So he went on to do that. And so that's life. Life's going great. The school's going great. They're raising money.
What year is that around?
That's 96, 97, 98.
So that's still right early on, within 2 years. Preston's like coming to get involved.
Well, Preston came initially.
Okay.
He came right away. Another guy named Jeff Thielman came to raise money from Boston. And Sister Judy Murphy was the principal. And one of her famous speeches was at the first faculty meeting right before the kids were going to come. She says, well, look, I got to tell you right now, we don't know what we're doing, okay? But the good news is nobody knows what they're doing with urban education, so we're going to invent it. All right? So it was a great, tension breaker that, we really didn't know what we were doing.
Yeah.
So that goes on. Then they're going to build a building.
So, no, wait a minute. So the Preston thing. So Preston's coming in.
He comes back. He quits his job, goes to work at Cristo Rey.
Okay.
And he invents, things that you went through, the morning check-in, the timesheet, the training, the putting the wood down, see how you can get over the wall and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Wow.
That's all Preston
Did
Kendall.
all that?
Yes.
Wow.
All right. So, stuff that every kid now, does.
I mean, I did that in 2003 and 4.
Yeah.
Wow. So it still was going on. Wow.
Yeah. So it was called boot camp, actually. And, of course, that's too militaristic, so we can't call it anymore that. But corporate study training or whatever. So, so he just basically invented it going along the way. He was a masterful salesperson, totally in love with the mission. And so they got the jobs pretty easily in Chicago. And it was a unique, and still a unique program, but it was new and unique at that time. And so he did very well there. So they're growing now. They're starting to get kids. They started with sophomores and juniors. The reason they didn't start with freshmen is the surrounding Catholic schools felt that they were going to be stealing students from them. And they kept saying, no, we're taking the students that can't pay you. That's what we're taking. Right. It's like, how many kids do you kick out at the end of the first year because they can't pay? Well, 10 or 15. Well, those are our kids. Okay?
Yeah, we're taking those.
We'll take those away from you. They still didn't get it. So as a compromise, they started with sophomores and juniors.
Gotcha.
And then they added freshmen and sophomores, and then they moved on up. So they're doing that. They got to build a building. So our building here in Cleveland was big enough that we could last 4 or 5 years without doing anything.
Right.
Theirs was not. It was a smaller school. So they need to raise a lot of money. And Jeff Thielman, the guy from Boston who was going to raise money, had been in Peru working. It's so bizarre. Peru is all over this. So he'd been in Peru working. He went around to churches to raise money for the project he was doing in Tacna, Peru, which is right on the border of Chile, I think, and Argentina. I can't remember which one. That's terrible geography on my part. I'm sorry. Edit that out and figure out which one it is. Right. It's on the border with Chile. It's on the border of Argentina. So anyway, he met a guy. He was at a church in California, probably Los Gatos or, Monterey, somewhere, a nice, wealthy church. And he gave his talk, and a guy came up to him and said, I'd like to help you. And he said, and then he went to get me. I don't have my checkbook. I'm sorry. Would you come home with me? So he comes home. He meets his wife, and he writes him a check. I think it was for $5,000.
Right.
Okay, which for Jeff Thielman was like a year's budget. Okay, so he was just flabbergasted. That guy's name was B.J. Casson, and his wife's name is B.B. So he was a very wealthy guy. So years later, they got to raise money. He figures, hey, I'm going to get B.J. Casson to come out here and look, see this school. So
touch it, feel it.
St. Mary's, the one where Deladava, whatever his name was, Deladava.
Delavadova.
Yeah, he went to St. Mary's, California. Big benefactor there.
Okay.
So he had the capacity to give this money. So he comes out. They give him the tour. They walk around. They show him pictures like you're behind you on the wall here of the new building and what it's going to look like and so forth. And then they say, what do you think? He says, well, I got good news and bad news. So they say, well, what's the bad news? Well, the bad news is I'm not going to give you any money for the building. Okay, that's bad news. What's the good news?
Right, that's horrible news.
Well, I want to go home, talk to my wife, and then I want to form a foundation that's purpose is to replicate this model in every major American city.
Holy crap.
That's kind of what they thought. And so Jeff Thielman was like, whoa. So, Foley's like, wow, that'd be tremendous. And I think Foley and BJ kind of talked about that before, but that was like a sidebar. And then
he saw it. And
that's what he got on to.
When he saw it,
and he was an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
He said, this is an idea that's going to just go crazy.
Right.
So he goes back to his wife, Bibi, and the next day calls up John and says, I'm going to put what amounted to $22 million into this foundation. Wow. I want you, John Foley, and you, Jeff Thielman, to work on figuring out how we're going to do this. All right. Now, remember, they're starting a school in Chicago, and this guy's saying, put one in every major city. So they're like blown away. This was in June of 2000.
Okay. So
John Foley calls me up at St. Ignatius, and he says, he tells me the story. I'm like, oh my God, John, that's unbelievable. I said, he said, well, Rich, here's what I think. There's an organization of schools in South America and in Peru called Fe y Alegría. Faith and happiness is what that means. And they've been going around for about 30 years, and I think there's 50 of them in Peru. And there's hundreds of them throughout South America. Now they're in Africa. I mean, several years later, but it's just a growing idea. They'd start in a small, horrible neighborhood in the third world. They'd get people together. They'd eventually build a building. They had a lot of support from European philanthropists to build the buildings, to get the money for the materials. And they would teach these kids skills that would allow them to survive in the third world. The mechanics, electric, sexist as it may be, a seamstress, something like that, where they got a skill they can get out of this abject poverty that they were living in. So that was the idea. Now, not that we would do the same thing in the United States, but how did they create so many schools with the same mission,
right, and
the same idea? How did they do that? So he first suggested to B.J. Casson that this, and BJ said, well, fly him up, and we'll talk to him. And he said, I don't think they could do that, Mr. Caston.
Yeah.
I think we better go down there.
You got to go down there, yeah.
He said, okay, well, then get some people together and go down there. So that's why he called me. He said, Rich, would you want to go down to Peru? It was October. So he called me probably June, July, and said, this October we're going. In 5 days, and we're going to investigate this, and then we're going to write a report.
This is October of 2000?
Yeah.
And you were still at Ignatius?
Yeah, still at Ignatius.
How that kind of, it was just like you kind of knew you were on.
Well, no, I was totally suckered into this.
How'd that happen?
Well, no, I thought 5 days, free trip to Peru, which I love. I've been there many times, with one of my best friends, who's a pretty fun guy. All right.
So Foley he knew, hey, I need help with this, and can you come?
Yeah, but I learned later that he wanted me to really get involved.
He was just.
But he presented it to me like I was a consultant.
Okay.
I said, because when he said this, hey, John, I already have a job and I'm really happy, where I'm at. Oh, no. You've had all this, which I had. I've been teaching since I was 21 years old. So in a Jesuit school, so I knew schools. So
right.
I went, honestly, selfishly, because it was a free trip to Peru with my friend, and I know we'd have a fun time. And what the hell, I'll learn something, and maybe I can help him.
Right.
Okay, that was why I went. No high motive here, or no calling or anything else like that. I just went, honestly, because it would be fun.
Right.
I'll be self-deprecating here, but I'm not lying. That's why. So I asked Father Welsh, who was the president, and he said, oh, yeah. He was classmates with John Foley in the seminary.
This is crazy,
it's ridiculous.
Too crazy.
It's ridiculous. So so he says, sure. So I go. We go down there, and I go down there with John Foley, the Jesuit priest, Father Larry Reuter, another Jesuit priest, who was my junior high school English teacher, who's now a priest and the head of mission at Loyola University Medical Center years later. And then Father Jim Steger, who I'd known, he worked for the provincial office of the Jesuits at the time, I think. But he was a high school principal, and I'd met him before in my travels in Jesuit world.
Okay.
So I knew everybody going. And I was the one layman again. So I remember in my room, we stayed in a high school, very ritzy, kind of like a St. Ignatius in Lima called Immaculata. All right. And huge school, K through 12. That's how a lot of them are in Peru, Jesuit. And so it had Padre Juan Foley, SJ, Padre this. And for me, it was Rich Clark, laico, meaning layman. So I stayed with the Jesuits. Okay. So we go to the first thing we're going to do is go to the Fe Alegria headquarters in Lima and talk to the guy who's in charge of Peru and just say, how did you do this? Mm-hmm. So we did. And we were sat at a table like we're sitting at right now. And he had a couple of people with him, and Larry and Jim and John and I were together. And we just peppered him with questions. And, the big question for us was, how do you start them? I mean, how does so many start so quickly? And, where do the people come from? And, it's not, in Fe Alegria is not like all Jesuit or all Christian Brothers or all whatever. It's here comes everybody. It could be any order. It could be a group of lay people. It doesn't matter. So he gave us the real answer. Mm-hmm. He said, well, fundamentally, it's the mission of what we're doing. Mm-hmm. The mission is so compelling, so needed, that people come to it.
It's the why.
It's the why. And it's perfect. I want to do this. I want to give my life to this because it's so good.
And what was the mission? What did they?
The mission was to take kids in urban third world countries, give them a high school education and prepare them for their futures, and have them be economic members of a society.
But I guess what I'm asking though is because that alone is not I feel like that's something everyone would agree to. How did they get? Like, is there a word or way to describe the mission to where everyone puts their whole body into it?
Well, it was because it was really for the kids that had no chance.
Gotcha. It was just had to be done.
Their tagline is, Fe Alegria begins where the asphalt ends. And the way cities grow in South America, and actually I think this may actually happen in our own city eventually, is that the central part of the city is where all the wealth is. And the further you are out, so the suburbs, if you will, are poorer and poorer and poorer until they don't even have roads. That's where Fe Alegria goes. Okay, so they go to the poorest sections of the city and start schools, which have no schools. In other words, when Jeff Thielman was in Peru working in Tacna, he was teaching at a Jesuit school, and he knew very little Spanish, and he was failing. He just didn't know what to do. So one day he went into the plaza of the town of Tacna and sat down. And when you do that, 10 shoe shine boys come up to sign your shoes.
Right.
They're all like 5, 6 years old.
Just trying to get some money.
Get some dough. So, he's like, sure, shine my shoe, So and he said, I knew enough Spanish to talk to a 5-year-old. Okay, so he says to the kid, why aren't you in school? Oh, I can't go to school. I got to bring money home to my mom and my dad. We got to work all day, and at night I have, there's no school. So it hits Jeff. Well, maybe we ought to have a school at night,
right?
And get the parents involved, and that's what he did. It was called the Center for the Working Child, and it's still in existence. Mm-hmm. And that was back in the 80s. He started that. That's why he was going around raising money. Was for that idea.
For that idea. So I got you off track. So back to your trip there, and
we're talking with this guy, but that story about Jeff is kind of similar because the need is so in your face,
right?
That there's a response. Mm-hmm. So here you go to. So he suggests to us, why don't you go to a school and see and talk to the founders and see what they did? And that's a great idea. So we go to a neighborhood in Lima called Montenegro, which is a teeming, what we might call a slum, just really, really tough. And we're in a cab, and we're going along, and it's getting, scarier and scarier as far as I'm concerned. Now, John Foley, who worked in these places, he was very familiar, and he'd been in Peru for 30 years, so he was fine. So then the guy stops the cab and says, it's 2 blocks that way. He just says,
I'm not going
any further.
Oh, my
I'm
God.
like, oh, God, help me. What are we going to do? So we're on foot, and now we are in abject poverty. Women who look like they're 50 who are really probably only 25 with infants and no kids without shoes and dogs in the street and sewage and half-built buildings. It's horrendous.
Right.
So we find a school. We knock on the door. Door opens. A nun answers the door, and we walk inside, and it's like a Disneyland compared to what's outside. Mm-hmm. Every kid is in a school uniform. They got shoes. They're lined up. They're the beautiful plaza, classrooms around. And, wow. It was like a miracle. And we're sitting there kind of waiting to be received by the director of the school, and I hear over the PA. I don't know much Spanish, but there was somebody talking with a Philadelphia accent in Spanish. I'm like, what is that? But it was the classic grade school. The fifth grade boys were elbowing the fifth grade girls in line. Right. I mean, it was safe, clean. Everybody, dressed properly. I mean, it was. And
the miracle was, it just wasn't something you was expecting when you walked in.
Because
like, oh my God.
Outside of those walls, it was like horror. Okay, so we meet with Sister Annette, is her name, and talk to her, and she tells us, well, I said, how long did this take to do this? And I remember she saying, well, it took about 15 years. Mm-hmm. And I remember in my first world mind thinking, 15 years? I mean, come on. We could do this in 5 years in the United States,
Right.
Well, just as an aside, we are in our 15th year here at St. Martin, and we still haven't built the whole building yet.
Right.
So she was way ahead of us.
Right.
So then she tells us a story of a woman who had gone to their school, their nun school, that was downtown, the wealthy school, so the St. Ignatius type school. I'm not harping on St. Ignatius. I love St. Ignatius, but it was just a wealthy school. So and she came to this school because she had a religious experience and wanted to do something. So she walks in just like we did, and she says to Sister Annette, I never knew kids like these could learn.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, oh, wow. So, again, my U.S. first world mind going, oh, my God, how could you say such a thing?
Right.
Now, of course, fast forward, I'm here at St. Martin, and I have people come down here and say, I didn't know these people valued education. I get the same line.
Right.
Same line. Okay? So I was prepared for the answer, though, after listening to Sister Annette. Yeah. So anyway, so she says to Sister Annette, well, Sister, I'd like to help you. All right? What do you need? Mm-hmm. Well, I'm still waiting for that woman to come to St. Martin here, by the way. She says, what do you need? And she says, well, we don't have a chapel. We have this beautiful school. We just haven't been able to build a chapel. And so she said, well, you have your chapel. And they built in our standards, not an incredibly beautiful, large chapel, but enough for that school.
Right.
And it was very simple. And she was kind of proud of it. And she said, would you like to come see the chapel? So, John and I were together. Larry and Jim were out, looking at the classrooms. And they had computers. I mean, it was absolutely amazing. So we said, sure, we'll see the chapel. Well, we're not going to say no. I mean, so we didn't come to see a chapel. But
you're there to see the school. So.
We'll see the chapel. So we walk in. Pretty simple. Paintings on the wall of Bible stories because a lot of the parents are illiterate. So a lot of the posters and everything are really telling the story, not by words, but by what you see. Mm-hmm. And so we're walking around. Nobody else is in there. And we get close to the front of the church, which is the altar, and then there's an exit back out to the plaza. Mm-hmm. And we stop a little bit. And, look, I'm not a particularly pious guy. Mm-hmm. I mean, I believe in God, and I have faith. But I'm not a, really holy roller religious kind of guy.
Right.
Nothing against that, but that's not who I am. So I'm standing there with John, and I become overwhelmed with a feeling. Not a word, a feeling. And it was fear at first. It was almost like I was getting an anxiety attack, which I don't get. And I started to kind of get shaky. And then I felt like tremendous love. tremendous love. And then I wanted to thank whatever was going. I mean, I was.
And this is in the chapel?
Yeah, I was possessed. I don't know what it was. So I'm starting to, tear up. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of shaky, and I'm overwhelmed. Is all I can say. And there was never any kind of word. It wasn't like build a school. There was nothing like that.
Right.
Okay. But it was this immense feeling, and even when I talk about it now, I get a little teary. Mm-hmm. And that was 18 years ago.
Right.
So I walk out of the chapel and I'm into the sunlight, and I know something happened because John said to me, "Are you okay?" I said, "I don't know. I don't know what just happened to me. I mean, was it hypoglycemia? I mean, I don't know what it was, but it was physical. Mm-hmm. I mean, it really took me over. So I am bewildered, mm-hmm. and you know me enough to know that I'm not bewildered all that often. Right. I'm bewildered. I'm kind of quiet, and again, not a typical thing of Rich Clark, and I'm stunned. So we get back, we finish our visit, we get back in the cab. Now we're going to go back to that fancy school, Immaculata, and we're going to write a report, that's why we're there, to B.J. Casson of how we're going to do this, okay, how we're going to make this big network. So we sit in a room.
Well, guys, sorry that we stopped episode 1 with that cliffhanger, but it's so you come back next week for episode 2 to hear Rich finish the story about his time in Peru and touch more on or complete the story on what happened and how he was moved to help create Cristo Rey Network and ultimately St. Martin de Porres High School. As always, hopefully you can support the show by spreading the word and sharing the links and messages to people you think might be interested in the story. Also, at the bottom of every episode, there will be resources that we think that could be applicable to you that the host or the person that I am doing the podcast with uses, as well as you also see on our website we have some ways that you can support the show through a Patreon account. There's a PayPal donation account, as well as a couple other ways that you can support the show in terms of just kind of letting us know anything that you would like the show to do differently, any questions you may have, anybody you suggest that we kind of maybe do a podcast with. All feedback is welcome. Thank you for listening to episode 1, and see you next week. Thanks.